Excuse me, ma'am, this is business class. Please return to your economy class seat. The voice of the young flight attendant, clear but cold, echoed in the business class cabin. Her eyes flicked over. The woman standing in front of her lingered on the worn AO dye. Faded with time. That simple outfit seemed out of place in the luxurious surroundings around her. The woman, around 70, was petite, with a kind face, but radiated an unusual calmness. She didn't answer, just silently offered the ticket in her hand. But her silence only irritated the flight attendant further. Do you understand what I'm saying? This isn't the place for someone like you, she emphasized, deliberately speaking louder, to attract the attention of the other passengers. The gazes in the business class cabin began to turn towards the woman. Some curious, some mocking, and some simply looking for a bit of entertainment on the long flight. A few stifled laughs came from the surrounding seats. The woman remained standing still. Her thin hands clutched the ticket, as if afraid it would be snatched away at any moment. But her eyes, those deep-set eyes, only stared directly at the flight attendant, unwavering. Look at the AO dye you're wearing, the flight attendant continued, this time deliberately sarcastic. Something this tattered must have been bought at a flea market. I doubt it's even worth the price of a meal in this cabin. The woman blinked slowly, as if the words couldn't hurt her. But her hand holding the ticket trembled slightly, her knuckles white from gripping too tightly. Excuse me, she said softly, almost a whisper. I'm just following instructions. This is my seat. The flight attendant smirked. If you continue to insist on sitting here, I will have to call the captain. And believe me, it won't be pleasant. Laughter erupted around them. Some even took out their phones to record the scene. But the woman didn't move. Her eyes now held a strange glint, like patience, mixed with some hidden strength. Fine, the flight attendant said sharply, a challenging smile on her face. We'll let the captain decide. I'll prove to everyone who is wrong. The flight attendant turned and walked away, not realizing each step was leading her towards a storm that she could never have anticipated. The flight attendant walked briskly towards the back of the cabin, where the intercom was to call the captain. On her face was a smug look mixed with a touch of contempt. She felt she had done the right thing, protecting the integrity of business class, a place reserved for those who deserved it. What a nuisance, she muttered while dialing. Someone wearing such a worn AO dye. How could they possibly sit here? Must have bought an economy ticket and snuck up here. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the cabin grew tenser. Some passengers seemed annoyed, not out of sympathy for the woman, but because their sleep or work had been interrupted. A man in an expensive suit sitting nearby sighed irritably. Why don't they just deal with this quickly? Such a waste of time. Another woman, dressed elegantly, glanced at the elderly woman and whispered to her companion. The flight attendant's right. Look at that AO dye. She's embarrassing the whole cabin. Meanwhile, the elderly woman remained seated quietly in her seat. The old AO dye, with its frayed threads, draped over her small frame. But her eyes, though a little tired, maintained a strange calmness, as if she were used to facing such judgmental stares. Just a few minutes later, the door between the business class cabin and the cockpit opened. The captain entered. A tall, middle-aged man, in a neat uniform, his eyes stern, scanned the passenger cabin before settling on the elderly woman. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low and authoritative. The flight attendant hurried over and whispered, "Captain, this woman doesn't have a business class ticket, but is insisting on sitting here. I asked her to return to her proper seat, but she refused to cooperate." The captain frowned and approached the woman. He stood directly in front of her, looking down at her with a stern expression. "Do you have a ticket for this seat?" he asked, his voice flat and firm. The woman didn't answer immediately. She slowly opened her old handbag and took out a crumpled airline ticket. Her hands trembled as she handed the ticket to the captain, but her gaze remained calm. The captain took the ticket and quickly checked the information. But as soon as his eyes landed on the line indicating the seat class, his eyebrows furrowed. His face went from surprise to confused, then to fear. A deathly silence fell over the business class cabin. The flight attendant, standing right next to him, tried to peek over the captain's shoulder. She didn't understand why his expression had changed so drastically. "Captain, is something wrong?" she asked hesitantly. Without answering, the captain turned back to the woman. His stern eyes were now filled with remorse and alarm. He bowed his head low, almost stammering as he spoke. Ma'am, you are the founder of this airline." Those words were like a thunderclap in the business class cabin. Some passengers gaped. A few immediately stopped recording. The air suddenly became so heavy it was hard to breathe. "Founder," the flight attendant repeated, her voice trembling. She turned to look at the elderly woman, who was still sitting quietly. But her eyes were no longer gentle as before. Her gaze was now sharp, cold, and authoritative. "Ma'am," the captain continued urgently, "I truly didn't know you were on this flight. Please forgive me for this disrespect." The flight attendant now stood like a statue. She began to realize her mistake, but didn't know what to do to salvage the situation. She stammered, I didn't know. I didn't know who you were." The elderly woman spoke softly, but her voice echoed throughout the cabin, like a judgment. "If I weren't the founder, do you think it would have been right for you to insult me?" The entire business class cabin fell silent. The passengers who had laughed earlier lowered their faces, avoiding her gaze. But she didn't care about them. She looked directly at the flight attendant, waiting for a response. The flight attendant couldn't say anything more. Her legs trembled as if they could no longer support her. She realized that her sarcastic words and contemptuous actions had left a stain that would be difficult to erase. The storm had only just begun. The business class cabin fell into a heavy silence, as if all the air had been sucked out of the space. Stunned gazes darted back and forth between the captain, the flight attendant, and the elderly woman. The elderly woman still sat quietly, her hands in her lap, her eyes straight ahead, without a flicker of panic. Her calmness was like a sharp blade slicing through the atmosphere. The captain, who had just been in the most powerful position on this flight, now stood with his head bowed before her. "Ma'am, I sincerely apologize. This is our fault, and I will take full responsibility." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly rose to her feet. Her old, worn, but neat AODI clung to her petite frame. But every step she took seemed to shake the entire cabin. "What's your name?" she asked, turning to the flight attendant. Her voice was soft, but sharp as a knife. The flight attendant flinched and didn't dare look up. "Why yes, my name is Twee." Her voice trembled. The words came out with difficulty. "Twee," the woman repeated her name, as if to etch it in the air. "Twee, do you think you have any right to humiliate me? Or any other passenger?" I didn't know you were." Twee tried to defend herself. But her voice grew smaller and smaller. As if she herself knew that the excuse wasn't convincing enough. "You didn't know who I was. But is that an excuse to treat me with contempt? If I were just an ordinary person, do you think what you did was right?" Her voice was steely. Each word, each syllable, like a hammer blow to Twee's conscience. The other passengers now began to fidget. Some who had earlier laughed or recorded video when they witnessed Twee insulting, now lowered their heads, staring at their faces flushed with shame. One man, who had initially seemed annoyed by her presence, now spoke hesitantly, I apologize for not intervening sooner. I truly didn't know you were someone like this." The woman turned to look at him. Her eyes softened slightly. "It doesn't matter that you didn't know who I was. But you should know that anyone, whether wearing a worn AO dye or dressed elegantly, deserves to be treated with respect." The man bowed his head and said nothing more. She turned back to Twee. "How long have you been a flight attendant?" "Almost 3 years, ma'am," Twee stammered. 3 years, she repeated thoughtfully. "In those 3 years, how many people like me have you insulted? How many people have endured your contempt? Simply because they don't fit the image that you deem worthy?" Twee didn't answer. Tears began to stream down her face. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she choked out. "I didn't mean to, I didn't think that." "You didn't think this was wrong? Or did you simply not think that I would be the one to make you regret it?" She cut her off. Her voice not loud, but full of authority, making Twee unable to look her in the eye. The captain intervened, trying to defuse the situation. "Ma'am, we will deal with this immediately. Flight attendant Twee will be suspended as soon as this flight lands. We are committed to imposing an appropriate penalty." The woman raised her hand to silence him. "It's not just because of me that you need to change. What needs to change is the entire way you operate. And the mindset of this airline staff." She turned and looked at each person in the cabin. Not just Twee, but also the passengers who had remained silent or laughed. "We all live in a society where it's too easy to judge others based on appearances. But today, I want to remind all of you of something. Respect is not the privilege of the wealthy, the beautiful, or the successful. Respect is a fundamental right of every human being." The business class cabin fell silent again. No one dared to utter a word. What she had just said was like a mirror reflecting into the soul of each person, so they could clearly see their own selfishness and superficiality. The woman walked to her seat and sat down. Her hands gently stroked the AO dye, steeped in the weariness of time. But her eyes still shone, still sharp as a small, smoldering fire, enough to awaken the entire silent space. Flight attendant Twee stood frozen. She knew this storm hadn't ended, but was only the beginning for unavoidable change. The captain quickly returned to the cockpit to resume his duties. But before he left, he bowed deeply to the elderly woman. He said nothing more, but the gesture contained both remorse and respect. Flight attendant Twee still stood there, her legs trembling, her eyes brimming with tears. She silently watched the elderly woman's small figure sensing that the woman's strength lay not in her appearance, but in her calmness and sharp words. The surrounding passengers gradually returned to their seats, but the atmosphere in the cabin remained thick. Some stole glances at the elderly woman, no longer with mockery, but with respect, tinged with shame. "Ma'am," Twee stammered. But her voice was so soft the elderly woman couldn't hear clearly. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, and took another step closer to the elderly woman. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry. I didn't know who you were, and I didn't mean to hurt you." The elderly woman slowly looked up at her. "Are you apologizing for not knowing who I was? Or for your wrongdoing?" That question stunned Twee. She didn't know how to answer. The excuses seemed to catch in her throat, and she could only stand there, head bowed, in silence. "Do you know what hurt me the most?" "No," the elderly woman continued, her voice low and gentle. "Not your words, but the fact that you truly believed you had the right to say those things, just because I was wearing a worn AO dye." The nearby passengers listened intently, though they tried to appear as if they were looking elsewhere. A young woman, sitting in a nearby row, suddenly stood up. She spoke, her voice slightly trembling but full of sincerity. "Ma'am, I also apologize. I laughed earlier. I thought it was funny. But now I realize I was wrong. I shouldn't have stayed silent, and I shouldn't have laughed like that." The elderly woman turned back, her gaze softening slightly. She nodded gently. "Thank you. Realizing your mistake is the first step to correcting it." Those words were like a spreading fire. One by one, several other passengers also stood up, apologizing for their indifference, their silence, or even their earlier laughter. Flight attendant Twee began to cry. This time not out of fear or anxiety, but out of genuine remorse. She lowered her head so low she seemed about to kneel. "Ma'am, I know I was wrong. I will accept any punishment. But please believe, I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Even myself. I just wanted to do my job well. But clearly, I failed." The elderly woman looked at her for a long moment, the anger gone from her eyes, only pensiveness remaining. Finally, she said, "Mistakes don't define who you are, Twee. But how you correct them will define who you are." The cabin gradually quieted, but the heavy feeling was gone. Instead, there was a gentle but profound awakening. Each person, rich or poor, powerful or not, or ordinary, realized one thing. Respect isn't a luxury, but a fundamental value. The flight continued, but the story wasn't over. Twee quietly returned to her work area, but didn't dare look up at the passengers. From today on, she knew she had to change. Not just for her career, but for herself. The elderly woman returned to her seat, her hands resting on her old AO dye. Though the garment had absorbed many contemptuous glances and insults, it remained her greatest pride. Outside, the sky was a deep blue. The flight continued, gliding through the clouds, carrying not only people, but also profound lessons that would be remembered forever. When the plane touched down, the afternoon sun was fading on the horizon. The passengers disembarked one by one, but the atmosphere in the business class cabin lingered. The embarrassment and shame seemed no one wanted to look directly into the eyes of the elderly woman, the one they had just hurt, either inadvertently or directly. Flight attendant Twee stood frozen near the aisle, trying to avoid everyone's gaze. The tears had dried on her face, But inside her was a chaotic storm. She felt small and worthless. Before that woman. The one she had once scorned. Just because of her simple appearance. Twee, the captain's voice called out, making Twee jump. He walked over, his face still stern. But his gaze somewhat softer. Be prepared. Management will review your case. After I submit my report. But before that happens, I want you to think carefully about everything that happened today. Twee bowed her head and nodded slightly without saying a word. The captain turned back to the elderly woman. And bowed deeply as if in apology once more. The woman said nothing. Only nodding slightly. And then left the plane. With slow but steady steps. The city on a bright spring morning. Soft sunlight shone on the building's windows. The airline's headquarters. In the spacious office. The elderly woman. Mrs. Hong Mai sat at her desk. On her desk was a picture frame. Containing a worn AO die. A symbol of the difficult years she had endured. To build the airline. From nothing. Ma'am, there's someone waiting outside. She says you invited her today. The secretary's voice came from the doorway. Let her in. The door opened, and Twee entered. She was no longer wearing her flight attendant uniform. As glamorous as before. But instead wore simple clothes. Her gaze, when she saw Mrs. Mai, contained both respect and a touch of anxiety. Hello, ma'am, Twee said softly, bowing her head. Mrs. Mai nodded and gestured to the chair in front of her. Sit down. I received your letter. Mrs. Mai spoke. Her gaze still gentle but no less serious. I want to hear it from you yourself. What have you learned from that incident? Twee sat up straight and took a deep breath. Ma'am. That day was a turning point in my life. At first, I thought that the punishment you gave me was unfair. But after thinking about it, I realized that I myself have been unfair to so many people. She paused, her eyes tinged with sadness. I've taken psychology courses. And customer service. I've also spent a lot of time volunteering. Meeting people who have been underestimated by society. Simply because of their appearance. I realized that everyone deserves respect. Not because of who they are, but simply because they're human. Mrs. Mai was silent for a long moment, finally nodding slowly. Good, you understand the most important thing. Ma'am, Twee said, determination shining in her eyes. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I just want a chance. To prove that I have changed. Mrs. Mai looked at her. A faint smile appeared on her face. You don't need to ask for a chance. Opportunity has always been in your hands. The important thing is whether you dare seize it or not. Twee began participating in the airline's internal training program of the airline, and became an inspiration to the new staff, new employees. Her stories about arrogance and the lesson of humility gradually spread, becoming a motivation for others to change their perspectives on customers and colleagues. Meanwhile, Mrs. Mai continued to lead the airline with a clear vision. More than ever before. Respect is the core of service. That day, as Twee left Mrs. Mai's office, she stopped in front of the building and looked up at the deep blue sky. She smiled, sensing that her life had truly changed. And from then on, she walked a path of respect and empathy. The story ends. But the lessons from that fateful flight continued to spread, touching the hearts of many forevermore.